Hello everyone, good morning. It's time to get started and I'm delighted that you're all here today for Advance HE's Governance Conference. I hope that you're going to really enjoy the day. We've got plenty on offer for you. I just wanted to bring to attention a few conference housekeeping aspects. We'd really invite you to use the chat function for questions for our speakers, and they'll be monitored by the Advance HE team. The networking lounge will be available so you can chat and network with other delegates. You might also find some polls there that we'll be really grateful for you to take part in. In the resources area, you'll find information and guidance on governing well, including our recently published Board Diversity and Inclusion Toolkit, as well as links to blogs and other useful information. And if you experience any technical issues or have any questions about the platform, then please do visit the help desk and they'll be delighted to help you. We just want to say a quick word of thanks to our conference sponsor. This is Board Effect, a Diligent brand, and you'll see that they have a session on with us today as well, and you can find them in the networking area. So without further ado, I really hope that you enjoy today and the packed programme that we have. And I'm now going to hand over to Andy Shenston to take us forward into our first session.
Good morning, everybody. It's absolutely fantastic to be with you here again at our fourth annual Advance HE Governance Conference. This is the second of these events that we've delivered online, and the first two, of course, being face-to-face. Always welcome your feedback, as Vicky said, about how the event has met your needs and your aspirations for the day. A couple of quick observations about the areas of focus. You tell us that whilst you value the work that Advance HE does in bringing together colleagues from across the sector to learn and to listen from each other, the risk in those sorts of conversations is that as a sector, we can become and are at risk of becoming an echo chamber. And one of the roles that we have as Advance HE, as a membership-based organisation, is to convene different colleagues from different sectors to come together with you from within higher education to listen to those different experiences and perspectives that those colleagues have, not only from their work in supporting other sectors, but also when their work spans both higher education, the work of the charities sector, private sector, international and global business. And so what you will see in today's conference is a very distinctive and particular flavour of conversation that we've invited our colleagues from across many different walks of life to bring to the virtual conference table. We're going to focus on inclusivity and fairness, as you would expect, a critical area, and indeed upon sustainability, another key facet of governance effectiveness for our sector and indeed all sectors. But we're also going to talk about strategizing and how the insight from those other sectors can be of value to us within higher education. You've also told us in preparing for this event and other work that we do with you that you're looking to hear voices and other perspectives that might not offer what you might say the norm in terms of the perspective on governance within higher education, that will offer challenge, that will offer constructive provocation. And that's very much behind our thinking and the thinking of many of these colleagues who we brought together today to do just that. So we hope, and I very much hope, at the conclusion of today, that what we will have accomplished is an opportunity for you to engage with colleagues that you know of and also new to you through the virtual platform, to listen to colleagues to whom you might not previously have the opportunity and experience of engaging with, and that you've been challenged and caused to reflect. We don't expect you to agree, or indeed it would be odd indeed if we did all violently agree with everybody else's perspectives, but that's good and that's great. And that's reflective of the inclusive conversation that we look to have today and that we invite you to participate in. That concludes my opening remarks, except now it falls to me to introduce the first of our keynote speakers, Dr. Shefali Yogendra. Shefali brings immense experience from corporate strategy from a variety of sectors, and you will have had the opportunity to look at her profile in terms of the speaking notes that we've provided for today's event. Shefali joined London Metropolitan University's Board of Governors back in August 2017 and has been working with the board and with colleagues to drive forward the development of the strategy of that institution. Without further ado, Shefali, over to you. Really looking forward to your talk, and what we'll afford our colleagues the opportunity to do is to throw questions into the chat box, and as we call to the conclusion of Shefali's opening remarks, we'll draw on those questions to get into a Q&A session for the balance of the time we have available in this opening session on governance futures, a vision beyond higher education. Shefali, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everyone. This is going to be a heavy talk to open the day, so I hope you've all got your stimulants, coffee, etc. ready. The impact of higher education accrues to society over decades. It's not just in the form of jobs that we create and our students serve in, and the value that they create, but also in how innovation emerges to solve some of the world's most pressing and urgent problems. It's therefore not an exaggeration to say that as folks in higher education governance, we do and should take our jobs pretty seriously. The decisions we make today will have an impact beyond our lifetimes. Therefore, we are here as stewards, as custodians of the future. So it is worthwhile to think about the governance futures for higher education from beyond higher education, as we are attempting to do all day today. So I thought first let's take stock in a quick sector agnostic way. What does our world look like at present? Well, for starters, our world is already pretty virtual. This talk is virtual. The higher education sector's delivery model has been virtual during the pandemic. I see many more colleagues of mine have made acquaintance of Twitter and LinkedIn and other platforms to keep in touch with their business contacts during this time. Digital currencies are mainstream. Bank of England is thinking deeply about a central bank digital currency too. We are seeing an uptick in the trading of digital art called NFTs. Interactive performance art is also real, as some of us saw with an episode of Black Mirror. Everything now has some degree of success with virtual formats, but this virtuality exists alongside physicality. We first noticed the physical integration and connectedness of the world very sharply when the pandemic did not stop. It just kept rolling. When physical movement was restricted and supply chains were throttled, and 2020 became the year of the missing toilet roll. Virtualization also brings opportunity. The world is truly our oyster, or any other animal metaphor you prefer, if you have a mollusk allergy as I do. So the next thing that I was thinking of is that our world is trying to be inclusive. And I say trying because we have some way to go. Take the stock, for instance. There is live captioning, which is happening alongside. I believe some of you can access it. But given my accent and a whole bunch of other limitations in technology, it's not going to be perfect. And that's a bit like our own inclusion efforts. At London Metropolitan University, where I'm an independent governor, 96% of our students are from groups that don't have easy access to university education. So the pursuit of inclusion remains one of the greatest challenges of our time. Our world also needs sustainable solutions that do not destroy our planet any further than we have already done. COP26 just wrapped up in Glasgow. So this is, of course, a topic on all our minds. We know that ice caps are melting. We also know that the oceans are accumulating our plastic waste that harms animals and plants. We are thinking how to create materials that biodegrade and how to repair and reuse products to extend their life rather than buy more stuff. Now, while on repair and reuse, I would like to quickly mention that the repair shop's favorite wood restorer, Will Kirk, is an alumnus of London Metropolitan University. So you see, some higher education institutions are already showcasing career paths that are possible in our search for sustainability in daily life. Further, our world is being automated. Now, at one point in history, washing machines were the height of automation. Now, when we think of automation, we think of robots that vacuum our homes, robots that make cars, robots that pick and pack our groceries. And we often read that robots will take all our jobs. That's not accurate. Specific tasks can be automated, but entire jobs may not get automated. Besides, Throughout history, we have been in periods of near full employment, and we are currently in one. Indeed, we are in the middle of a wave of mass exodus from employment, which is being titled the Great Resignation. What history does tell us is that jobs change, they don't remain steady. And over time, we make peace with the changed jobs and sometimes come to look upon some of the past jobs with some horror. I mean, none of us in this room is exactly wishing for the return of the malnourished miner who was sent down the chimney to clean it. So some jobs equally that exist today will not exist tomorrow, but new jobs will be created. This means the real challenge is reskilling and constant learning and easy access to ways to update skills, which is where higher education can play a vital role. And finally, our world is owned by a much smaller number of entities than most seem to realize. A vast majority of the world's businesses are now directly or indirectly owned by 3 companies: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. They are referred to collectively as the new permanent universal owners. They are invested indefinitely in thousands of businesses around the world. Now let me pause for a second here while you reflect on the impact of that little nugget of information. 3 companies are invested indefinitely in thousands of firms around the world and are called the new permanent universal owners. This means that this new ownership model has enormous concentrated power. In turn, if these 3 firms choose to drive changes in governance, it could very quickly morph into stewardship and inclusive stakeholder capitalism, which is no longer being debated as a need, but is quietly acknowledged as a need of our time. So this is the backdrop against which we as higher education board directors and governors and other people in governance need to consider the questions in front of us. The question of balancing free speech with our duties under prevent, the question of academic freedom to ask difficult questions versus cancel culture, the growing casualization as well as growing pension deficits in our sector, and finally, the very question of our identity as a sector. Are we nonprofit, as our legal form dictates, or are we public sector, as our accountability and funding mechanisms suggest, or are we private sector with all the related reporting and compliance requirements and the scramble to find alternative revenue streams as we try to protect ourselves as going concerns? So with all this backdrop, it is worth investigating what we can learn from beyond the boundary walls of higher education. Here are some of my thoughts. First, climate action, ESG, and related transparent reporting will be the cornerstones of good governance in the future. As you know, we are all waiting for the outcome of a BASE consultation on restoring trust in audit and corporate governance. As part of that, the government is exploring whether third sector entities, and that would be us, should become public interest entities. The implications for governance are going to be several. For instance, there'll be additional reporting requirements on capital maintenance, on corporate resilience, and audit and assurance policies. Beyond higher education, when we look at stock exchange listed entities, we know that there is already additional requirements to report extensively on climate risk, climate action, ESG, and inclusion. All this signals that higher education governing bodies would be wise to consider a preemptive move to integrated reporting, where our strategic vision and KPIs flow into our organizational structure and accountability mechanisms, our organization's risk appetite and risk culture, and a distributed ownership of what value we think we create and how we create that value. So the second point is that the march of technology and social platforms is inevitable. I began my career in the tech industry when everybody did not have seamless web access, even at their office desktop, leave alone in their homes, or as we are now used to, in our pockets. I was on a social network called 6 Degrees in 1997, and I've been an early adopter of LinkedIn and Facebook since 2004, Twitter since 2008, Quora since 2010, and many others. The fact that my iPhone has more processing power than the computers that put man on the moon still manages to fill me with wonder. Technology enables vast opportunity. We are operating in an increasingly marketized world in higher education. Although I will admit I'm one of those holdouts who don't like the idea of equating a student with a consumer. But the role of technology remains huge. It shapes what we sell. And let's make no mistake, we are selling. How we sell, as in how we make accessible and distribute what we are selling, whom we sell to, and what is said about us and our brands. This opportunity is quite widely distributed now, and that allows non-traditional players to bring several new games in town. Being fleet-footed, many of them are able to address segments of students and learners that were still not addressed sufficiently by traditional higher education providers. But this is a universal challenge, the challenge of technology. In the investment industry, for instance, wealth managers and brokers used to be gatekeepers for investors like you and me, aiming to access the stock market. Now there are several platforms that help people like us to participate in the stock market, put money into IPOs, and build our own pension portfolios. Technology has democratized participation in the stock market for the self-directed retail investor. This process has done so well that many companies now find that up to 3/4 of their shareholder register is made up of self-directed retail investors as opposed to institutional investors. The role of technology, of course, goes beyond business as usual. The pandemic and the rolling lockdowns last year forced businesses to activate their business continuity plans pretty much in a hurry last year. The business continuity plan in London Metropolitan University kicked in before many had even noticed we had a pandemic rolling towards us. As a result, we were one of the first home universities, if not the first university, to send our staff and students safely off-site into virtual spaces. Not only that, as I mentioned earlier, we are aware that we serve a very non-traditional student body. The senior leadership team took steps to ensure that we address the digital divide in terms of device and data poverty that could hamper our students from learning during a pandemic. What this means in plain English is that Chromebooks and web access dongles were given to people who needed support in order to continue to access learning in the pandemic. When we rely upon distributed connectivity so much, we have to be cognizant of the attendant risks. In some ways, the way technology underpins every aspect of our businesses reminds me of the sorcerers Apprentice. I hope some of you remember what that story is about. It requires constant vigilance. As we know, several universities were brought to their knees by cyber attacks last year and this year. Many leaders of those universities have been kind enough to share with some of us in painful detail what their experiences were like and how they rebooted the universities back up. Given the trends in cyber risk, and I do hope your boards are tracking that, it is a matter of when, not if, that we get cyber attacked. And what we need is readiness and preparedness to deal with things when they happen. Or, to quote a military intel and cybersecurity expert friend of mine, prepare your logistics in real time, in peacetime, so you know what to do in wartime when you're attacked. I would say that higher education governing bodies that are not tech savvy in the most strategic and horizon scanning way are not really fit for purpose in this evolving context. Which brings me to another universal challenge and lesson we can learn: talent and inclusion. Talent and inclusion will undergird governance and its transformation into stewardship. That's almost a truism. In order to contend with the major shifts that I just outlined, higher education sector is going to have to attract talent from spaces and sectors and backgrounds that have traditionally not been the ponds in which we fish. We're looking at two different things here. First, that while specialist talent, say corporate finance and HR, will remain quite valuable on university governing bodies, good governance for the future will require deep generalists. These are people who have multidisciplinary toolkits and experience, who can see the bigger picture, who can connect dots, and who can indeed connect dots that some of us are not even looking at, and who can see further along the risk horizons to keep the organizations that they oversee agile, nimble, and proactive. And the second thing we are looking at here is that we will be fighting the corporate sector and many others for this talent, for access to this talent. Which brings me to the final idea for consideration. I have talked about this since I started serving on boards, and I'm told that the idea still makes our colleagues in higher education very uncomfortable. But we are in the business of exploring challenging ideas, right? So here it is. Pay for talent. We as governors know that our decisions will reverberate beyond our lifetimes. Surely, these decisions will benefit from the perspective of those who are in the liminal space of transition from old models of higher education to the ones that exist now and the ones that will arise in the future. In the spirit of widening inclusion, these decisions will also benefit from the perspective of those who've had very different educational experiences amongst all of us, and those who have had different formative and lived experiences. Not all of these people have had long or highly paid careers or have good pensions. Many are young. Their employers may allow them to serve on higher education boards, but they may deduct pay for those days. Many are women and people of color, and evidence shows that they are systemically underpaid throughout their careers. It is really hard to make the moral case for wanting to benefit from their perspective, but ask them to do it for no pay. Asking systemically underpaid people to continue to take a financial hit is a special kind of lack of foresight and empathy. So how do we tackle it? By challenging the entrenched practice of not paying people who serve on boards of higher education institutions. Now, this is not idle talk about challenging and how it can drive change. I'd like to share a recent story. It's almost a few weeks old, actually. I was recently appointed to the board of an energy security company that listed on the London Stock Exchange just a few days ago. Now, directors of listed companies face institutional investor demand that they invest up to 2 years of fees, if not more, into the companies. So we get paid, but we are supposed to plow that back into the companies. This is to show that we have skin in the game. While we were preparing for this energy security company IPO, I made the case against this very specific expression of skin in the game. Listed company boards often look like spaces reserved for those who've had long and very profitable careers in the city. Technology-enabled emerging sectors, however, need specialist knowledge beyond just how money works. This means people with specialist experience and talent need to be attracted to these boards. The assumption that all such people that we want on our boards have large chunks of money available to invest in one asset, leave alone one asset class, suggests that there is a gap in the understanding of value addition and value creation. The invested sums are announced to the stock market, and you can check how much we invested in all our press coverage. But the invested sums, therefore, should not become a league table of the director's relative wealth. It may not surprise you to know that we included our intention in the prospectus, and not one institutional investor batted an eyelid. We made the case for broadening access to talent, for building inclusive boards fit for purpose and ready for tomorrow. We made the case for a lower but identical sum to be invested by all directors as a way to enable that inclusion and as a way not to make that a league table of our relative wealth. Whether it's going concern or cash reserves or pension deficits or indeed attracting talent, money does make the world go round. But money is also fungible, and we can use it to signal what we really value. Paying people shows we welcome them, we value their contribution, and it goes beyond the lip service to inclusion. So, folks, from beyond higher education, the vision for higher education is quite simple. Higher education governance of the future will be climate savvy and sustainable, transparent and accountable, underpinned by technology, but also unafraid to break new ground to ensure equity and inclusion, to reflect the society we are here to serve. Thank you for your time this morning. Over to you, Aaron.
Thank you very much indeed, Shefali. Absolutely stimulating and already lots of questions coming in. So what I'm going to do now, colleagues, is curate those questions, see if there's some connections or common themes, and bring that to Shefali's attention, and just allow Shefali an opportunity just to take a glass there and just get ready for some reflections. So really picking up on a number of key themes there, Shefali. One of the early questions from Rona Morris, which I think you probably addressed in some of your remarks, was around the essential skills and capabilities which the boards of higher education institutions will need to respond to in the future, but which they may not have considered essential now. You did speak around getting tech savvy and some other areas whilst retaining the core, but would you like to say anything to expand on that particular point for Rona's question?
I think there are a few. There's more than tech savvy. I would say that people need to be ESG literate.
Yeah.
So they need to understand what environmental, social, and governance considerations affect the business, and they will. I mean, if we are trying to give broader access to higher education, we need a board that understands what that does. The second skill, obviously, is the tech savviness, and it goes beyond just understanding our provisioning capacity, but also cybersecurity, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
And asking questions about what is the most important resource we are trying to protect. You will remember that from the coverage of cybersecurity at cyber attacks that have happened in higher education, organizations that had research and attachments to hospitals were especially targeted.
Yeah.
And they were targeted by state actors. Now, in order to contend with those people, all we can do is batten down our hatches, but also collaborate with the cybersecurity and team in GCHQ, for instance, to actually know what we need to do in order to batten down which hatches to batten down, essentially. So we are going to have to do much better collaboration, which means we need people who are what I call polyglots, people who don't just speak the language of one particular function or one particular discipline, hence the need to have people who are grounded in multiple disciplines. And therefore, if we track back, we need to actually have better interviewing processes to be able to extract the value that they will add without being afraid of their particular specialist sector jargon and so on. So I think skills and capabilities that we need would be ESG centricity or literacy, technology, multidisciplinarity, and the ability to actually interview people.
Thank you.
Which I will say is quite a challenge.
Absolutely. And there's a connection here because there's a further question. And I think the question is probably obvious to all of us, but let's just draw it out. Pete Whittard said, well, I think it's a great observation in the context of seeking to engage those that can do it for no fee. We're limiting the pool of talent. Agree, we need a diversity of skills. And Michael Scott saying paying for talent, absolute requirement. And he's got a question about CEOs not engaging with the board. I'd like to come back to that as a second question. I'd just like to pick up this issue of reward or recognition or remuneration and link it back to the point you've just been picking up there about skills and talent. Because it seems to me, or at least my perception is that if we only embrace the ideal of what we might call volunteerism, late career volunteerism, those that can afford, and this idea of giving back. And you and I, in preparing for today, got a debate around the contentiousness of that statement, giving back. Could we just unpack this issue about it's not just around inclusivity, but it's also about getting access to the right skills and talent that might drive one more towards a more professional or a more professionalized approach to sectoral or institutional governance. What's your perspective on the connection between those issues?
So I would say, first of all, that everybody is free to make their choices. Right? So we freely serve, I hope. We freely serve when we serve on boards of companies. We do it out of our own volition. And at the same time, it's important. And I have heard people on higher education boards say, well, this is voluntary. Well, it's not voluntary as in I have free time, I will go and make tea for some people in the old home near my house. It is voluntary to the extent that you have fiduciary duties attached to it. So you better read the board papers in time and have some good questions, because there are plenty of people who turn up to board meetings without having read any board papers. I'm not referring to my colleagues, but I speak with 30 to 40 other directors pretty much every week. Because they are my colleagues in different sectors. And it's really interesting to see how the common themes emerge, that there's a large percentage of people who don't prepare. So that aside, to your point that some people see this as giving back, I find the phrase giving back quite offensive. We are personally, each of us, a net taker from this planet, from this society, and we have this tendency to privatize our success to our own wonderfulness while socializing any failure that we may have had. Each of us, if we truly looked at our own backgrounds, we will know we are the product of a lot of organizations and individuals' charitable instincts. Indeed, there is a conversation right now going on in the Financial Times, which I don't know how popular it is in our audience, but there is a conversation going on right now about essentially talking about how people try and downplay what class they come from so that they can feed into the narrative of meritocracy. But I see that I'm digressing from the main point. So if people have very many different backgrounds, if they understand, for instance, what is happening in EdTech, you will find that the age distribution in EdTech is quite skewed away from yours and mine on the lower side, right? If we are to get the younger people who are going to be alive a longer time and are seeing what's already happening, we are going to have to entice them. And if they choose to do things that are more profitable, more exciting, how are we going to sell it to them? So incentive design does play a role. And it should be up to an individual to say that I will do this as a volunteer, and not for the organization to say that this is how we are going to do it and you're going to have to fit in. So to force people to do volunteerism is also not a good thing. We are a free society. And as I said at the end, it's not an idea that's popular, but that's an idea I bring up frequently, because if you're going to ask people who have great experience, who can actually monetize the experience elsewhere, you're going to have a very good story other than, oh, this is a wonderful thing for your soul.
Yeah.
To sell to them, right?
Thank you. Question from Christine Donnelly. In the context of if HE boards become PI, so public interest entities, that brings additional requirements potentially. Do you think that might deter people from joining boards or staying on? I might almost expand the question and say, what implications does it have for board culture? Because we are what we do, and that sort of affects the cultural dynamic. Any reflections on that trajectory that might offer us?
So this is not a theme only for higher education. This is discussed on nearly all boards, that the requirements of compliance and reporting and, all kinds of litigation possibilities, activist investors in case of listed companies, are so many that people are beginning to consider leaving boards. At the same time, one has to consider the possibility that we do it because we want to do it. So while some people will probably retire away from boards or never consider boards, we have to consider that the number of people coming out of organizations and otherwise value adding in society far exceed the number of board seats available. So we will probably always have a rich talent pool if you want to look beyond the traditional talent pools that we look at. But to Christine's point about will it come from the additional requirement that arises from becoming PIs, I must say that I'm a very bold appointment on my chair's behalf as the chair of audit and risk. I'm not a chartered accountant. The job of an audit and risk chair is not chartered accountancy. Financial work is a small percentage of what we do all year. So we have to think about what we have learned from our work experience or our professional experience, what values we are bringing, on what value add we are creating on the board, and are we willing to do the work? And invariably, a lot of the conversation about, oh, people are not going to join boards or stay on boards that I see in listed companies happens because people are complaining that we do too much work and we don't get paid nearly enough. So we have to consider what people do with their time is always within their control. And it's up to us to design the incentive structure as well as the disincentive structure to attract the right kind of people and actually repel the people who don't want to do the work. Gillian Tett has written an article either today or yesterday. I read it this morning, so I couldn't say when, where she's saying that people who are prone to feeling a little bit of guilt actually do the morally right thing in their workplace. I'm not sure I totally agree with her thesis, but there is something to be said about it. If you're conscientious, you will do the work. But then you have a right to say, look, I'm doing so much work right now that I'm getting paid per hour basis, less than minimum wage. Is that really sustainable? So it's a whole lot of different things in the mix other than just the regulatory requirement. It is the sheer amount of work we have to do.
Absolutely. Questions keep threading through. I'm going to go back to an earlier one, which I hadn't picked up yet, which was from Michael Scott. And he's been asking around, in this context of, you've cited integrated reporting. It's certainly an area Advanced HE has been doing quite a lot of work with a number of institutions on. But within a context of regulation, and potentially not competing sort of overlapping legislative requirements in terms of reporting and external accountability. There's sort of a slightly wicked question around, given the diversity of those requirements from different organisations, how do we manage that process? I'm not sure there's an obvious or easy answer to that one in terms of dealing with the external stakeholders, but I wondered if you had any particular perceptions on sort of the navigation of those challenges.
So Michael is exactly right. There is very many overlapping often demands for the same data to be packaged and presented different ways. Indeed, there is, for instance, if you do the pay ratio calculations, you can do them on the basis of 3 months of data, or you can do them on the basis of 12 months of data. Now, with my electronics engineer hat on, I will say that if you sample a signal more frequently, you're going to have a high fidelity sound at the other end. So if you do the 12 months, your numbers are going to look different, but probably will be more accurate. So the problem is far worse than the question suggests, although it tries to cover a lot of different things. I think it is up to us to identify the most important metrics we track, the ones that have the best overlap with what is being asked for. Obviously, nobody can plan for policy by tweet, which happens quite frequently. But if we were to prepare we have to be data strong, basically. We have to be able to extract data that we have in the organizations to be able to report. I mean, I literally see, 7 or 8 different types of metrics, most of them new in every audit and this committee meeting. So I'm a sector outsider. Before I became a governor, I was only a student and an adjunct professor. I had never seen under the hood what really goes on.
Yeah.
So I'm still learning every day after 4 years of being on this board. So we have to identify the metrics that we see as most important, look at the ones that the legislators and the regulators want, and become, with some effort, data savvy organizations where we can pull out data, not at the drop of a hat, but can pull out data as it is asked of us in variable formats from time to time. This does require us to go back to our infrastructure and look at what is it that we are prepared for in the future, how to become as future-proof as is feasible within our foresight, and so on.
Quite a few conversations within our audience around the concept of payment, whether it's compensation as opposed to sort of with a more reward element built in. I think as we've discussed some aspects of that, I'd like to take a slightly different track. We've already got opportunity for maybe two quick areas. One I'd like to ask, and then one I'm going to dip into the discussion to draw from. What I'd like to ask is about your role, our role as mentoring the next generation of governors, because you've spoken very eloquently about the need to us to support and create systems that are porous, that drive and enable inclusivity, both from talent and skills and from broader perspective. So we engage wider society in the leadership and governance of our institutions. But that demands a role of all of us to actually facilitate that. And I'd be interested, what do you do personally to sort of fly the flag on that and create opportunity for those that you see around you with whom you engage with, and what would you share with colleagues to let them take away as thoughts for their own practice?
So as you probably know, Andy, I am a former board apprentice. I joined my JP Morgan subsidiary board that I still serve on as a board apprentice in January 2016.
Yeah.
And I was taught really well. I mean, the chairman did a very good job, and she does like to be called chairman and not chair, so I am specifically referring to her as chairman. She did a really good job of tutoring me into the basics of this industry.
Yeah.
The joke I had before that was that I know Mayfair, that's the finance I knew. I didn't know the city. I still use the Google Maps in the city to make my way around. But in 6 months' time, they felt that I was going to be a very strong contributor to the board and offered me to join the board. The process took a couple more board meetings, etc. And then I became a full board director. Yeah. So the board apprentice program, which Charlotte Valeur created, is an obvious answer to me. With my London Metropolitan University governor hat, we have our second board apprentice in place right now. We started with the first one last year in the middle of the pandemic. And she was so good, we hired her, essentially. So she's an independent governor. Yeah. The gap that people often see is that there's something called board readiness, which itself is a whole different thing. Yeah. But then people, when you are board ready from your CV, headhunters will tell you don't have experience. So the apprenticeship plugs that gap.
Yes.
And the third thing that I do in my personal capacity is that I speak in women on boards events and other independent events. Elevate City is going to do an event in a couple of weeks' time where I'm going to talk to a whole bunch of CXOs who are looking at becoming NEDs but don't know how to make the leap from being on the executive totem pole to being on the governance totem pole. So I kind of help them realistically think about whether they are really ready, psychologically ready, because this is a job that requires you to be quite entrepreneurial in how to look for opportunity, how to look at your own CV, not from I can do this to I can oversee this, right? And also look at how you go about developing yourself. Nobody is ever going to pay for your training.
Yeah.
I mean, the university did pay for my training with Naseem Talib last year before I became the audit chair, but nobody is going to pay for your training anymore. Are you the kind of person who's autodidactic, who actually learns constantly? How much of your own money are you willing to spend on it after a lifetime of somebody else spending on you all the time, right? So there are all those different things, and most of the preparation is not in the CV, it is in the psychology. And to my, from my side, institutionally, I try and talk about the idea of board apprenticeship and do implement it where I can. And I do talk to people all the time. That's how those 30 to 40 conversations a week come about. Some with colleagues, some with aspiring NEDs. And it's always excellent to be able to talk to so many people about it. Yeah.
Fantastic. We've got about 3 minutes left, which means we've got an opportunity for a short question, which I will extract from the chat, and then a reflection from yourself. Awful lot of things we could dip into, but sort of covering the broad territory. Question from a colleague, Kim Ansell, who's reflected on your observation on key skills and being ESG literate. And how do we persuade, her question as written is, how do we persuade higher education institutions that stemming from finance and investment communities, that it's relevant and transferable to education? So bringing those all capabilities from other sectors from an ESG context into HE. Any particular reflections on that as a sort of a closing point, please?
So I would, interestingly, I'll say about a decade ago, I was already trying to have my consulting clients see the idea of the triple bottom line. The idea has existed a very long time. It is just that it is seen as an idea of the time and has a nice new packaging and a 3-letter acronym to go with it. So in order to look at ourselves, I mean, when we report on going concern, we are essentially saying that we are also an operating business.
Yeah.
And we have the exact same considerations. In fact, more social obligation and an imperative to do better governance than many other organizations have in their lines of business. So this is quite relevant to our sector. And we do have students who come from abroad. We do have influence over the course content and the course offerings that we have, and how we run our institutions. A lot of universities in the pandemic lockdown were worried about their revenue streams because they relied heavily on their real estate.
Yes.
Whether it was for rental income or for giving out the space for events. And those events consume energy, produce waste, and as does our normal operation. So it is as relevant to us as a sector as it is to the financial institutions, where it is becoming more and more a part of what reporting we have to do as board directors.
Fantastic. Well, that just gives us 30 seconds to a minute to conclude this session. Shefali, that's been a terrific start to the event, and thank you so much for your generosity of time giving to us this morning. Lots of really, lots of feedback, lots of people how inspiring that's been, very thoughtful. Obviously, colleagues going away with quite a lot of reflection, and that's what we want. Taking something away, reflecting on existing practice, and taking that back to one's own organisation, one's own lived experience, one's own environment. So, Shefali, on behalf of all the colleagues here at the event and myself and Advance HE, thank you very much. I'm deferring to colleagues on the logistical side, but I think I'm right in saying that we're now scheduled to take ourselves into a 15-minute break, and then we will be restarting at 11 o'clock with a panel session chaired by my colleague Aaron Porter on getting governance right. So if I can hand back to our logistical colleagues for the event and just put us on standby, and we'll recommence at 11. Thank you very much indeed, colleagues. Join you shortly. Thank you, Shefali.